It was Halloween of 2020, and I was in the 12th grade. My friends and I had grown out of trick-or-treating a long time ago, but we still liked to celebrate the occasion. My friend Dan lived in a different neighborhood, and his parents were okay with us having people over, so it was our go-to spot whenever we wanted to have a party, or a gathering of any kind. I lived in a different neighborhood, which was about an hour away on foot, so I took the bus there. There was one other guy in my friend group who lived in my neighborhood, so we actually took the bus together. Tom lived a few doors down from me, and we had been good friends since about the 3rd grade. Neither of us bothered to get dressed up or anything. I was never really into that. Nothing much happened at the party. It was a pretty typical night. We mostly just talked about whatever and played Super Smash Bros. In Dan's basement. I don't even know if party is the right word. There were only 7 or 8 of us. By the time we decided to head home, it was past 11, and the bus that we needed was not running anymore. Since it was only an hour on foot, Tom and I decided to walk instead of bothering our parents. Our route home was all on well-lit streets, and our neighborhood is pretty safe, so we were not that worried. It was actually a pretty nice night. Tom and I were really good friends, and we were happy to have the time to talk, and if I'm being completely honest, we did a bit of gossiping as well. Even though it was a Saturday evening, the streets were pretty much deserted. We only saw 5 or 6 cars the last half hour of walking. We were about halfway home when a brown van passed us on the street. It slowed down when it was about 20 feet ahead of us. Tom and I looked at each other with concern. The van stopped, and we continued walking. I was hoping that it was nothing, and that it stopped for some other reason. Tom and I stopped talking and looked forward as we walked past the van. When we were in front of it, it started moving again, but slowly. It was driving at our walking pace. We tried to ignore it, but suddenly we heard a voice from the front seat. "Hey guys, what are you doing out so late? Need a ride?" a man said. We continued walking, but I turned my head and said, "No thanks, we're good." He kept driving slowly beside us, trying to convince us to take the ride. The guy gave a few reasons why we should accept the offer. It's cold outside, it's dangerous to be walking alone. He even said that we could get in trouble for being out so late. We were in 12th grade, so we weren't stupid. So the more we talked, the more we were sure that we were not getting into this guy's van. Tom and I were genuinely creeped out at this point. We knew that we needed to get away from this guy, but we didn't know how to do it. If we really needed to, we could have knocked on some doors of the houses in the area. It was all residential around there, and I'm sure that would have scared him off. However, after another few minutes, a police car turned down the street and approached us from behind. This was strange because the police did not come to this neighborhood often. If we saw a police car, it usually meant that someone had called for it. The black and white car slowly cruised towards us, and as soon as it got close, the van took off. The officer stopped next to us and called us over. "Hey guys, do you know who that was in the van?" the officer said to us. We said that we didn't, and then told him the whole story. After that, the officer told us that several people had called complaining about a guy in a van bothering kids while they were trick-or-treating earlier. It turned out that he'd been looking for this guy for a few hours. The police officer gave Tom and I a ride home and assured us that another officer was going to be dealing with the van. This was a pretty scary incident, but I realize it could have been a lot worse. I can only imagine what he would have done if we'd gotten in. If we were younger or more naive, then maybe we would have. But luckily, that didn't happen. Not this time. Where I come from, the night before Halloween is a special occasion of its own. It's a night meant for mischief and trouble. This is the night where some of the more rebellious kids go around in egg houses, throw toilet paper over trees, and just cause general mischief. I'm not proud to say it, but when I was younger, I was one of those more rebellious kids, and I got into my share of trouble for things that me and my friends did on October 30th. By trouble, I mean getting grounded mostly. I even had my Xbox taken away one year. But this story is about a completely different kind of trouble. In fact, it was one of the most horrifying things that's ever happened to me. I was in the 10th grade, and I had recently started hanging out with a different group of friends. My group from elementary school had lost touch when we started high school. We went to a pretty large school, the largest in the city, I think. It was at least a few thousand students, so everyone seemed to gravitate toward whichever group they wanted. My new friends were seen somewhat as troublemakers, but I thought and still think that they were actually good guys deep down. We would do little things like sneaking into the movies or doing prank calls to the teachers' houses. Nothing serious, but we did get into some trouble. So when Halloween was approaching, it went without saying that we would go out and do something. We met at my friend Justin's house. He lived just down the street from me, so I just walked over. Our other friend Travis lived farther away, so he had his dad drop him off. I brought my black school bag, but I emptied out all the books and filled it with 8 to 10 rolls of toilet paper. I bet you can guess what that was for. Travis did the same, but he brought a few cartons of eggs instead. It was still bright out. The streetlights hadn't even come on yet, so we hung out in Justin's basement and played some video games while we waited for the night to fall. At around 10 or 11 p.m., we started walking around the neighborhood. The streets were not quite as empty as we were hoping. There were still cars driving around, and most of the houses had lights on. It would be difficult to do anything without getting caught, so we continued walking for several blocks. Eventually, we found a section of the street that looked a little quieter. We chose a house there, and threw a few eggs. Then we tossed a roll of toilet paper over the bushes in the front of the house. It was all decorated for Halloween with a few large pumpkins on the front porch. It seemed like nobody was home, so Travis walked up and grabbed one of the pumpkins, lifted it over his head, and smashed it on the walkway. Just then, the lights turned on and the door opened. A large man stood in front of us. He was probably 6'4", but at the moment, he looked even bigger. He had short hair and a beard. His eyes were shooting daggers at us, but he didn't say a word. Justin and I bolted, but Travis must have frozen in fear, and the man grabbed him. We looked back when we realized that our friend was missing. The man had his arms wrapped around Travis. I couldn't tell for sure what he was trying to do, but thankfully, he didn't seem to be throwing any punches. As we got closer, it became clear that the guy was trying to drag Travis into his house. Travis screamed, but the man didn't let go. The anger on his face was spilling out. Small drops of saliva spouted from his open mouth as he breathed with the intensity of a gorilla. His bloodshot eyes turned to me as I approached them. We grabbed Travis's arm and pulled with all our might. He screamed out in pain as we stretched his body. Eventually, the man let go, and the three of us sprinted out of there. We ran as fast as we could past the rows of houses until we felt safe enough to stop and catch our breath. I realized that what we did was wrong, and I wouldn't recommend anyone try it. Fun is fun, but vandalizing a stranger's house is not in the spirit of Halloween. However, I don't think we deserved what happened to us, and it still terrifies me to think of what would have happened if that guy managed to get Travis into his house. This happened several years ago on Halloween, when my kids were still young. I had taken them trick-or-treating that evening, and had my parents come over to hand out candy at our house. My parents lived in a high-rise building that was all senior citizens, so they didn't have to hand out candy at their place. My neighborhood, however, was much younger. At least half of my neighbors had kids that were trick-or-treating age, so we always went through a lot of candy. I didn't mind though, because I've always loved Halloween. One of the joys of being a parent is that you get to relive a lot of your favorite things from your youth, so I always enjoyed trick-or-treating with my son and daughter. We know most of the people in our immediate neighborhood, so I don't think we talked to a single stranger the whole night. Also, my kids were young, so we were pretty slow and only managed to hit 10 or 15 houses total. We called it a night around 8 p.m. and then headed home. After I put my kids to bed, my wife and I saw my parents out. By this time it was around 10 p.m. My wife and I sat on the couch and watched some TV. I was eating a few pieces of leftover Halloween candy when the doorbell rang. I stood up and walked to the front, then looked out the window beside the door. There was a man standing there alone. He was about 6 feet tall, wearing black pants and a black sweatshirt. He had some kind of Halloween mask on, but it was pulled up over his forehead. He He saw my face when I looked out the window and smiled at me. Against my better judgment, I opened the door and stood there blocking the entrance to my house with my body. The man introduced himself and said that he was just taking his son trick-or-treating in the neighborhood. Then he asked if he could use my washroom. I looked at him confused for a few seconds, then finally asked, "Well, where's your son?" "Oh, he's just waiting in the car," the man replied. That didn't make any sense. First, it was very unusual for anyone to drive into our neighborhood to trick-or-treat. I get that some people live out in the country and can't do it in their own neighborhood, but it is very uncommon. Second, it was past 10 p.m., and trick-or-treating had been over for at least an hour by then, so what was he doing during that time? All that considered, I politely declined and firmly closed my door and made sure to lock it. I stood there for 30 seconds or so, waiting for the man to leave. When he did leave, I poked my head out the window and watched as he walked to the street and got into his car. I had to squint my eyes to make sure, but I'm absolutely certain that there was nobody waiting in the car. He didn't have a son with him at all. I was suspicious of this man from the start, but I still have no idea what that guy wanted to do in my house. Maybe he was some kind of burglar trying to scope us out as a target. We didn't really have anything valuable though, so I'm not really sure why all the effort would be worth it. I'd understand if we had a secret vault filled with gold bars that he was trying to pull off some kind of epic heist, but that's not the case. Perhaps his motives were even more sinister, but that's something that I'd prefer not to even consider.